The Shadow Baron and the Silent Bride. Welcome to a journey through time where the secrets of the human heart intertwine with the shadows of imperial Brazil. Prepare to discover a story that transcends eras, where silence speaks louder than words, and where love is born even in the deepest darkness. Opening hook. Imagine a bride cast out at dawn, her dress torn, walking alone down a dusty road. This is just the beginning of a mystery that has haunted the Paraíba Valley for years. What makes a man so feared that 5 brides fled from his presence? Is he truly cursed? Or is there an even more disturbing truth hidden in the shadows of his plantation? Where are you watching this story from? Leave your city in the comments. I love knowing where our listeners are from around Brazil and the world. If you appreciate narratives that touch the soul and unveil the mysteries of the human heart, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and leave your like. Your participation motivates us to always bring more exciting stories. Year: 1863, Paraíba Valley of Rio de Janeiro, Imperial Brazil. Era: pre-Paraguayan. War period, height of coffee culture. Dawn stretched its pale fingers over the dusty road when Mariana emerged from the shadows, her wedding dress transformed into rags that danced in the wind like ghosts of shattered dreams. The French silk fabric, once white as hope, now bore the stains of red earth and tears that would not cease to flow. She walked barefoot, her feet wounded by the stones of the path, but it was the wound of her soul that hurt most. The 5th bride in 3 years to be expelled from the plantation of shadows before the sun could even rise on her first day of marriage. The 5th young woman to return to her family, carrying only humiliation and whispers of curse. The Paraíba Valley awakened slowly, cradled by the aroma of coffee that spread across the verdant hillsides. In the distant slave quarters, voices rose in melancholic songs that echoed between the mountains like ancestral laments. It was in this setting that the legend of the Shadow Baron grew, fed by the fears and superstitions of an era where the inexplicable found fertile ground in simple hearts. Rodrigo de Sampaio e Castro. The name was pronounced in whispers in the taverns, accompanied by hurried crosses and furtive glances. They said he had made a pact with darkness, that he demanded profane rituals from his brides, that the slaves of his plantation had cast a terrible curse upon him. The elders shook their heads and murmured about vengeance from beyond, about sins that cry out to heaven and tormented souls that wander among the coffee groves. But legends, like shadows, often hide truths more complex than imagination dares to conceive. The thick air of the port tavern carried the smell of pipe smoke mixed with the sweat of men who had wagered more than they could afford to lose. Colonel Barbosa contemplated the cards in his trembling hands, feeling the weight of destiny lean against him like a tombstone upon his chest. The plantation he had inherited from his father, the lands that 3 generations of Barbosas had cultivated, with coffee and sweat, everything was now reduced to this final play. The price of coffee had plummeted like autumn leaves, and debts accumulated like storm clouds on the horizon of his life. "One last card," he murmured to himself, ignoring the pitying gaze of Joaquim, the administrator of the Plantation of Shadows, who watched the game with calculated interest. When the final card was revealed, silence spread through the tavern like a shroud. He had lost everything: the plantation, the house, even the dignity that remained in his name. It was then that Joaquim approached, his small, cunning eyes gleaming in the yellowish light of the lamps. "Colonel, perhaps there exists a way to resolve our situation," he said, his voice smooth as oil on troubled waters. "My master needs a wife, different from the others, one who will not question his nocturnal studies, his peculiar habits." Barbosa raised his eyes, a spark of hope igniting in his chest. "Esperanza is 19 years old," he whispered, the words emerging like a confession. "But she, since the scarlet fever at 8 years old—" "I know she is mute," Joaquim interrupted with a smile that did not reach his eyes. "That is precisely why she is perfect. The Baron will pay double the debt, but there is one condition. Once married, she may never return to her family. The contract is irrevocable." That night, while rain drummed against the colonial tiles of his house, Colonel Barbosa signed the sentence that would forever change his daughter's destiny, never imagining that he was delivering not a lamb to sacrifice, but a silent force capable of transforming darkness into light. 3 days of travel through plantations that extended like green seas of coffee led Esperanza to her destination. The carriage swayed heavily on its iron wheels, and with each kilometer traveled, she felt more distant from the world she had known. When she finally glimpsed the plantation of shadows, her heart gave an uneasy leap. The colonial manor house rose majestically atop a hill, but there was something disturbing about its architecture. Gothic towers had been added to the traditional lines, creating a strange fusion between the familiar and the sinister. Tall, narrow windows seemed like watchful eyes, and the slave quarters that spread around remained curiously empty. Doña Benedita, the middle-aged mulatto governess, received her with silent dignity that mirrored her own. Her almond-shaped eyes carried untold stories, and her calloused hands spoke of a life that had transitioned between servitude and hard-won freedom. "Welcome, my lady," she said with a melodious voice while leading Esperanza through the shadowy corridors. "The Baron is in his studies, but we will celebrate the wedding at dawn." What impressed most were the mirrors, all of them, without exception, covered by black cloths as if the entire house were in mourning. Esperanza slid her fingers over one of the fabrics, feeling curiosity awaken in her mute breast. The wedding took place in the private chapel, before the rooster could even crow. A nervous priest hurried through the Latin words, while half a dozen slaves attended as reluctant witnesses. Rodrigo had remained with his back turned throughout the entire ceremony, and when he turned to accept Esperanza's silent yes, she saw only shadows projected by the flickering candlelight. But something in his eyes, a deep and ancient pain, touched her heart in a way that words could never explain. The master bedroom of the manor house breathed history in every jacaranda piece of furniture and every burgundy velvet curtain. Esperanza waited seated on the edge of the canopied bed, her hands intertwined over the simple dress that had replaced her wedding attire. Rodrigo entered hesitantly, carrying a lamp that projected dancing shadows across the walls. He remained on the opposite side of the room, as if an invisible wall separated them. "I know you cannot speak," he finally said, his voice hoarse with contained emotion. "Perhaps it is better that way. Words frequently lie." It was then that he turned completely toward the light, and Esperanza saw for the first time what the shadows concealed. The right half of his face was a map of scars, burned skin that extended down his neck and disappeared beneath his shirt collar. His right eye, miraculously spared, shone with the intensity of one who looks at the world through pain. Esperanza rose slowly, moved by an impulse that came from some deep place in her soul. She approached him as one approaches a wounded animal, without haste, without fear, and when she extended her hand to touch the scars with infinite tenderness, Rodrigo collapsed. Tears he had not shed for years burst forth like rain after a long drought. He allowed himself to be embraced by that silent woman, who had not recoiled before his deformity, who had not asked about pacts with demons or ancestral curses. 8 years, he whispered against her hair. 8 years of solitude. That night, there was no consummation, only two wounded souls who recognized each other's pain. Rodrigo told her about the mill explosion, about the previous brides who had fled in terror, about the golden prison his own house had become. And Esperanza, in her eloquent silence, began to weave the first threads of a healing that both judged impossible. The months that followed brought subtle but profound changes to the plantation of shadows. Like flowers that bloom after winter, rooms long closed were reopened, letting in light and fresh air. Rodrigo hired again the slaves he had dismissed years before, and the coffee fields returned to echo with work songs. Esperanza discovered that the nocturnal studies that so amazed the popular imagination were in truth astronomy sessions. Rodrigo had built an observatory in the highest tower of the house, where he spent nights mapping constellations and studying celestial movements. His notebooks were filled with scientific annotations and botanical drawings of impressive precision. She learned the silent language of the stars, communicating with her husband through gestures, expressions, and words written in shared notebooks. Rodrigo taught her about the medicinal plants he cultivated in his own greenhouse, and she responded by creating a garden of aromatic herbs that perfumed the entire house with lavender, rosemary, and basil. Doña Benedita observed this transformation with maternal satisfaction. She saw how Esperanza brought back humanity to the man who had become a shadow of himself, and how Rodrigo, in turn, offered the young woman a world of knowledge and discoveries that her limited education would never have provided. But not everyone viewed this change favorably. Joaquim, the administrator, began to perceive that his control over the plantation's finances was being threatened. Rodrigo had returned to taking interest in business, questioning expenses and decisions he had previously accepted passively. And when a man accustomed to power feels his foundations shaking, He is capable of the most desperate acts. The discovery happened by chance, as frequently occurs with the most important truths. Esperanza had explored almost every corner of the manor house, except the west wing, which had remained sealed since the accident. One afternoon, when Rodrigo had gone out to supervise the harvest, and Joaquim was in town, she found a hidden passage behind a library bookshelf. The corridor was covered with dust and cobwebs, but at the end there was a door ajar that led to the wreckage of the old sugar mill. There, among rubble of rusted machinery and charred beams, she discovered a metal box miraculously preserved. Inside, letters, dozens of correspondences that revealed a carefully orchestrated conspiracy. Joaquim was not merely a greedy administrator, he was a murderer. The letters documented how he had purposely sabotaged the mill's boiler, calculating the exact moment when Rodrigo's father would be inspecting the machinery. The plan was to eliminate both father and son, assume control of the plantation, and sell it to foreign speculators. Rodrigo had survived by chance. A last-minute meeting had delayed him, but his father had died instantly in the explosion, and Joaquim had assumed administration, claiming to be fulfilling the deceased's wishes. Esperanza felt her blood freeze in her veins. Not only had Rodrigo been the victim of an attempted murder, but he had lived all these years alongside the man responsible for his father's death. And worse, Joaquim certainly planned a second attempt now that his control was being threatened. She carefully kept the letters and left the destroyed wing with her heart racing. She needed to warn Rodrigo, but how could she do so without concrete proof? How could she convince him that the man he had trusted for 8 years was, in truth, his greatest enemy? The answer would come sooner than she imagined, and in a way that would almost cost her her life. Twilight tinted the sky violet when Esperanza returned to the mill ruins, determined to gather more evidence. She did not perceive that she was being watched until it was too late. "Excessive curiosity can be dangerous," said Joaquim, emerging from the shadows like a malevolent spectre. His small eyes gleamed with murderous coldness, and in his hands he held a rusted iron bar. Esperanza retreated among the debris, her heart hammering against her ribs. Joaquim advanced slowly, savoring the terror he saw in her eyes. "You found the letters, didn't you? I always knew that sooner or later this would happen. That's why I needed to get rid of Rodrigo before he became too interested in the past," he laughed bitterly. "I killed his father 8 years ago, and I was planning a second accident for the son. But you brought him back to life. You ruined all my plans." He raised the iron bar, preparing to deliver the fatal blow, when a voice thundered among the ruins. "Joaquim!" Rodrigo appeared at the mill entrance, his face transfigured by fury. Doña Benedita had noticed Esperanza's absence and alerted her master, who had run desperately after his wife. "So you discovered," said Joaquim, turning to face the man he had tried to kill twice. "No matter. I'll finish both of you here." The confrontation was brief but brutal. Joaquim had the advantage of the improvised weapon, but Rodrigo fought with the fury of one who finally knew the truth. They struggled among the rusted gears and the wreckage of machinery that had once been the plantation's pride. At the climax of the fight, Joaquim stumbled and fell onto a large gear that broke loose from the structure. The weight of the metal crushed his chest, and he died as he had lived, surrounded by the consequences of his own cruelty. Rodrigo embraced Esperanza among the ruins that witnessed both the birth and death of their torments. There, where everything had begun, they finally found freedom. The truth about the cursed baron spread through the Paraíba Valley like fire in a dry sugarcane field. Within weeks, the entire region knew that Rodrigo de Sampaio e Castro was victim, not executioner. The stories about demonic pacts and ancestral curses transformed into whispers of compassion and admiration for his wife's courage. The plantation of shadows was reborn like a phoenix from its own ashes. The slaves, treated with unprecedented dignity, responded with loyalty and productivity. Esperanza assumed administration of the house and created an improvised school for the workers' children, teaching them through gestures, drawings, and infinite patience. Rodrigo returned to publishing his astronomical studies in scientific journals from Rio de Janeiro, gaining recognition as one of the empire's most respected botanists. The plantation's observatory became a reference point for other scholars who came from afar to consult his research on tropical flora. When Colonel Barbosa appeared at the plantation months later, attracted by his daughter's new prosperity, it was Esperanza who received him on the veranda. She wrote few words on a paper and handed it to him. "There is no place here for one who sold me like cattle." The colonel departed with his head hung low, understanding that he had lost forever not only a daughter, but the chance to know the extraordinary woman she had become. The house mirrors were finally uncovered. Esperanza wanted Rodrigo to see not only his scars, but also the beauty they had failed to destroy, the beauty of a soul that chose love instead of fear. 2 years after the wedding, when the yellow ipe trees of the Paraíba Valley exploded in flowers like golden fireworks, Esperanza discovered that she carried in her womb a promise of the future. The pregnancy proceeded peacefully, cradled by Doña Benedita's attentive care and Rodrigo's silent devotion. But on the night when the time came for birth, a summer storm crashed down upon the plantation with unbridled fury. Lightning cut through the sky like swords of light, and wind howled between the colonial tiles like souls in torment. The labor was long and difficult. Esperanza fought in silence, as she always had, gripping Rodrigo's hand while contractions swept over her like waves from a turbulent sea. Doña Benedita commanded the women from the slave quarters who came to assist in the birth, their expert hands guiding the life that insisted on coming into the world. When the first baby finally emerged, a boy with dark hair and powerful lungs, relief was general. But minutes later, Esperanza felt new contractions, and everyone understood that another surprise was reserved. The girl was born at dawn, when the last thunderclaps were fading beyond the mountains. Small and pink, with her father's clear eyes and her mother's serenity. It was then that the miracle no one had dared to expect occurred. When they placed the twins in her arms, Esperanza looked at them with infinite tenderness and whispered, in a voice hoarse from so much silence, "Vicente, Helena." These were the first words she had spoken in 11 years. Rodrigo wept like a child, and even Doña Benedita, always so restrained, let tears flow freely. Motherhood had returned to Esperanza, not only her voice, but also hope for the future. The year 1867 arrived in the Paraíba Valley, carrying the winds of the Paraguayan War, but at the plantation of Shadows reigned a peace that contrasted with the turbulence of the times. The gardens that Esperanza had cultivated bloomed exuberantly, perfuming the air with jasmine and roses that competed in beauty with the stars that Rodrigo mapped in his study nights. Vicente and Helena, now 4 years old, ran through the corridors of the manor house like small whirlwinds of energy. The boy had inherited his father's scientific curiosity and spent hours observing ants and collecting colorful stones. The girl, in turn, demonstrated precocious talent for letters and already helped her mother in the improvised school of the slave quarters. Rodrigo regularly published his studies on tropical astronomy, gaining international recognition. His correspondence with European and North American scientists grew each month, and he planned a trip to the Imperial Observatory of Rio de Janeiro to present his discoveries about the Southern Cross constellations. Esperanza, in turn, had become the soul of the community. Her voice, recovered miraculously, was used sparingly but with profound impact. She had organized a community library, taught the slave children to read and write, and her reputation for wisdom and kindness had spread throughout the entire region. The plantation prospered not only economically, but socially. The slaves received dignified treatment, adequate food, and their families were respected. Rodrigo secretly planned the gradual manumission of all of them, anticipating the changes he knew were inevitable in the empire. During the war, the plantation provided provisions to the imperial troops, and Esperanza organized a temporary field hospital for wounded soldiers returning from the conflict. Her compassion for those who suffered echoed her own journey of pain and healing. On Sunday afternoons, the family gathered in the observatory to contemplate the sky. Vicente and Helena asked endless questions about the stars, while Rodrigo patiently explained the mysteries of the universe. Esperanza observed in silence, remembering the frightened young woman who had arrived at that house 5 years before. One May morning, when the leaves of the coffee groves whispered secrets to the wind, an elegant carriage climbed the plantation road, raising clouds of golden dust. From within it descended a middle-aged woman, elegantly dressed, but with eyes that carried shadows of ancient sorrows. It was Mariana, the 5th bride who had fled from the plantation of Shadows years before. Now married to a prosperous merchant from the court, she had come in search of answers to the ghosts that still haunted her. Esperanza received her in the main room, where delicate tea was served in fine porcelain. Mariana observed with surprise the transformation of the house, the bright walls, the fresh flowers, the atmosphere of peace that permeated each room. "I needed to come," said Mariana, the words tumbling out nervously. All these nights, I wondered, what was so terrible about him that made me flee without even looking back? Esperanza served the tea with gracious movements, then took paper and pen. She wrote carefully, "Fear of the unknown is sometimes greater than the unknown itself. But the stories, the rumors about curses, about pacts with demons, only scars," said Esperanza, her voice soft as a summer breeze. "All of us carry scars, some on the skin, others on the soul. The difference lies in how we choose to live with them." At that moment, Rodrigo entered the room carrying Helena in his arms, while Vicente clung to his leg. Mariana held her breath, seeing the scars that had so terrified her years before, but now she also saw the gentle eyes, the paternal smile, the genuine happiness that emanated from that man. "Forgive me," she whispered, tears sprouting. "I was so young, so frightened." "There is nothing to forgive," responded Rodrigo, his voice free of resentment. "Each person finds love at the right time, in the right way. Esperanza came to my life when I was ready to receive what she had to offer." Mariana departed at the end of the afternoon, carrying a peace she had not felt for years. The visit served as a reminder that the past, however dark it may be, can be transformed when illuminated by understanding and forgiveness. The autumn of 1867 brought changes that extended far beyond the limits of the plantation of shadows. Discussions about the abolition of slavery intensified at court, and Rodrigo knew that the social transformation of the country was irreversible. In a secret meeting with Esperanza and Doña Benedita, he presented a plan he had been gestating for months: the gradual liberation of all the plantation's slaves, accompanied by an education program and land redistribution that would allow them to build an independent life. "It will be a slow process," he explained, spreading maps over the library's mahogany table, "but we can divide part of the less productive lands into small lots. Those who wish to stay can work as partners, receiving a percentage of the harvest." Esperanza smiled, recognizing in her husband the same humanitarian vision that had attracted her from the beginning. Doña Benedita, tears in her eyes, expressed gratitude for finally seeing the dream of freedom become reality for so many she considered family. The plan was implemented discreetly over the following months. The oldest slave families were the first to receive manumission, along with small plots of land and seeds to begin their own plantations. The transition was surprisingly smooth, as the mutual respect built over the years had created bonds that went far beyond the master-slave relationship. Vicente and Helena grew up seeing this social transformation as a natural part of life. For them, the idea that people could be property of others was absurd. Esperanza ensured they understood from early on the values of equality and human dignity. Rodrigo's observatory also became a center for secret meetings of progressive plantation owners who shared similar ideas. Slowly, the influence of the plantation of shadows spread throughout the region, planting seeds of change that would bloom in the decades to follow. At night, when the stars shone like diamonds in the dark velvet of the sky, the family gathered to contemplate infinity. Rodrigo pointed to distant constellations and spoke of possible worlds, while Esperanza lulled the children with songs that her own mother had sung years before. The summer of 1868 arrived laden with omens. An unusual drought affected the Paraíba Valley, and the coffee groves began to show signs of suffering. It was during this period of uncertainty that a letter arrived at the plantation that would forever change Esperanza's perception of herself. The envelope bore the imperial seal and was addressed specifically to her. With trembling hands, she opened it to find correspondence from D. Pedro II himself, who had learned of her educational work through reports from foreign travelers. "Most illustrious lady," the letter read, "news has reached our ears of your magnanimous work among the less fortunate of your region. Your dedication to education and your innovative teaching method have caught the attention of educators at court. It would be our pleasure to invite you to present your ideas at the Brazilian Historical and Geographical Institute." Esperanza read and reread the letter, barely believing the words. Rodrigo, who observed her expression of amazement, approached to share the historic moment. "The Emperor wants me to speak at the Institute," she murmured, her voice still fragile with emotion. "Not just speak," Rodrigo corrected, smiling with pride. "He wants you to teach. Your techniques for educating mute and deaf children are revolutionary. You developed a unique sign language, adapted to Brazilian reality." Esperanza then realized that her personal journey of overcoming had transformed into something greater. Her own muteness, which she had once considered a curse, had become the key to helping hundreds of other children in the same situation. Doña Benedita, who had witnessed the entire transformation, nodded her head with wisdom. "I always knew the lady was destined for great things. God doesn't close a door without opening a window." Vicente and Helena, now 5 years old, listened to the adults' conversation with the natural curiosity of children. "Is Mama going to speak with the Emperor?" asked Vicente, his eyes wide. "Mama is going to teach the Emperor," corrected Helena, always more perceptive than her brother. That night, while the family celebrated the unexpected honor, Esperanza reflected on the mysterious paths that life traces. She had arrived at that plantation as merchandise sold by a desperate father, and now she was recognized by the Emperor himself as a pioneer educator. But the greatest revelation was yet to come. The journey to Rio de Janeiro was a revelation in itself. Esperanza, accompanied by Rodrigo and the children, marveled at the grandeur of the imperial court. The palace of Quinta de Boa Vista, where she was received by D. Pedro II, seemed like a materialized dream. The emperor, a cultured and visionary man, listened attentively to her presentation on educational methods for children with disabilities. Esperanza demonstrated the gestural communication techniques she had developed, explained how she had adapted games and playful activities to facilitate learning, and presented the extraordinary results obtained in the improvised school at the plantation. "Your approach is truly innovative," declared D. Pedro II at the end of the presentation. "We would like to implement your ideas in imperial schools throughout the country." It was then that the most emotional moment of the entire journey occurred. A young woman of about 15 years, accompanied by an elegant lady, timidly approached Esperanza. The girl made hesitant gestures trying to communicate. Esperanza immediately recognized the signs of a deaf child, struggling to be understood. She knelt to the young woman's height and began to converse fluently in the sign language she had created. The girl's face lit up like dawn. For the first time in her life, someone understood her completely. Tears of joy ran down her face while she gestured animatedly, telling about her life, her fears, her dreams. The young woman's mother, visibly moved, addressed Esperanza. "My daughter has been deaf since birth. The doctors said she would never communicate normally. You have just given her back her voice." Esperanza smiled, remembering her own journey. She turned to the girl and gestured. "Your voice was always there. It just needed someone to listen to it." The return to the plantation of shadows was triumphant. News of the imperial honor had spread throughout the region, and a crowd awaited at the railway station to celebrate the success of the silent baroness, who had become the voice of the voiceless. Years passed like calendar leaves carried by the wind. Vicente became an engineer, specializing in railway construction that would bring progress to Brazil's remote corners. Helena followed her mother's footsteps, becoming the empire's first educator, specializing in deaf children. Rodrigo published scientific works that placed him among Brazil's great naturalists. His discoveries about tropical flora were fundamental for the development of national medicine. Esperanza expanded her school, which became a model for similar institutions throughout the country. Hundreds of children passed through her hands, learning not only to communicate, but also to dream. On a golden December afternoon in 1875, when the ipe trees bloomed again in the Paraíba Valley, Esperanza sat on the manor house veranda, watching grandchildren play in the gardens she herself had planted. Doña Benedita, now with completely white hair, knitted at her side. "Who would have thought," murmured the old governess, "that frightened girl who arrived here would become the most respected woman in the region?" Esperanza smiled, caressing a letter she had just received. It was from a former student, now a teacher in Bahia, telling about her own school for special children. "Sometimes," she said, her voice serene as the waters of a lake at sunset, "we need to lose ourselves to find ourselves. We need silence to discover our true voice." Rodrigo approached, his temples already silvered by time, but his eyes still shining with the same intensity as the first day. He sat beside his wife and intertwined his fingers with hers. "Do you know what I discovered in all these years of marriage?" he asked. "What?" "That true love doesn't need words. It reveals itself in gestures, in presence, in the daily choice to remain at each other's side, transforming darkness into light." The sun set over the Paraíba Valley, painting the sky in golden and rosy tones. At the Plantation of Shadows, which no longer bore that dark name, being now known as Plantation Hope, two souls who had found each other in darkness contemplated together the miracle of a life built upon the foundations of love, understanding and faith in the transforming power of human goodness. And thus, like all great love stories, this one had no end, but an eternal beginning in the hearts it touched and the lives it transformed.